In the history of the world, there are few people who have changed their countries as much as Nelson Mandela changed South Africa. He was a man who spent 27 years in prison for fighting against unfair laws. When he was finally free, he could have chosen anger and revenge. Instead, he chose forgiveness and peace. He became the first black president of South Africa and helped his country move from hatred to hope. Nelson Mandela showed the world that one person can make a difference, no matter how difficult the situation seems. He taught us that the power of forgiveness is stronger than the power of hatred. His life story is not just about one man's struggle for freedom. It is about the courage to stand up for what is right, even when the cost is very high. Mandela's journey from a small village boy to a world leader is one of the most inspiring stories ever told. He faced many challenges and made many sacrifices, but he never gave up on his dream of a free and equal South Africa. His story teaches us that with patience, courage, and determination, we can overcome even the greatest obstacles. Today, people all over the world remember Nelson Mandela as a symbol of peace, justice, and human dignity. His legacy continues to inspire millions of people who are fighting for freedom and equality in their own countries. His life reminds us that we all have the power to make the world a better place. If you enjoy learning about great leaders like Nelson Mandela, please subscribe to our channel. We have many more inspiring stories of people who changed the world waiting for you to discover. Early life in rural South Africa. Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela was born on July 18, 1918, in a small village called Mvizo in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. His father, Gadla Henry Mfakeniuswa, was a local chief and counselor to the royal family of the Thembu people. His mother, Noskeni Fanny, was the third of his father's 4 wives. In the Xhosa tradition, polygamy was accepted, and Nelson grew up in a large, extended family. When Nelson was born, his father gave him the name Rolihlahla, which means pulling the branch of a tree in the Xhosa language. Some people say it also means troublemaker. This name would prove to be very fitting for the future leader who would challenge the unfair system of his country. The name Nelson was given to him much later by his teacher at school, as was common practice at that time. Nelson's early childhood was spent in the beautiful rolling hills and green valleys of the Transkei region. This area was designated as a homeland for black South Africans under the apartheid system, but to young Nelson, it was simply home. He grew up listening to the stories of his ancestors, learning about the proud history of the Xhosa people, and understanding the traditional ways of his culture. When Nelson was 9 years old, his father died of lung disease. This event changed his life completely. According to Xhosa custom, Nelson was sent to live with Chief Jongan Taba Dalindiebo, the regent of the Thembu people. The chief had been a friend of Nelson's father and had promised to take care of the boy if anything happened to his father. Living in the chief's household at the Great Place in Mqhekisweni was like entering a new world for Nelson. The great place was much larger and more modern than his family's simple home. Here he was treated like one of the chief's own children and received the same education and privileges as the chief's son, Justice. At the great place, Nelson learned important lessons about leadership and governance. He would sit quietly in the corner during tribal meetings and listen to the elders discuss important matters. He watched how the chief listened to all sides of an argument before making decisions. He learned that a good leader must be patient, wise, and fair. These early lessons would stay with him throughout his life and influence his leadership style many years later. The chief believed strongly in the importance of education. He sent Nelson to a local Methodist school, where the boy learned to read and write in English, as well as his native Xhosa language. Nelson was a good student who enjoyed learning. He was particularly interested in African history and the stories of great African leaders who had fought against colonial rule. At school, Nelson began to understand more about the world outside his village. He learned about the history of South Africa and how European settlers had gradually taken control of the land that had once belonged to African peoples. He began to see how the laws of the country favored white people and discriminated against black people. These realizations planted the first seeds of his future political awareness. When Nelson was 16, he underwent the traditional Xhosa circumcision ceremony that marked his passage from boyhood to manhood. This ancient ritual was very important in Xhosa culture. During the ceremony, an elder told the young men that they were now warriors, but that they were warriors without weapons or power in their own land. He said their land had been taken by white men who did not respect African traditions. These words had a deep impact on Nelson and made him think seriously about the future of his people. After completing his elementary education, Nelson was sent to Clarkberry Boarding Institute, a Methodist high school. This was the largest African school south of the equator at that time. Here, Nelson met students from many different African tribes and cultures. He learned that despite their differences, African people faced similar challenges under white rule. This experience broadened his understanding of the struggles facing all black South Africans. At Clarkberry, Nelson excelled in his studies and became interested in boxing and running. He was a tall, strong young man who carried himself with confidence and dignity. His teachers and classmates respected him for his intelligence and his natural leadership abilities. He was beginning to develop the qualities that would make him a great leader in the future: education and growing political awareness. After finishing at Clarkberry, Nelson continued his education at Healdtown, a prestigious Methodist college. This institution was known for producing many of Africa's future leaders. The school had high academic standards and emphasized the importance of discipline, hard work, and moral character. Nelson thrived in this environment and continued to excel in his studies. At Healdtown, Nelson was exposed to new ideas about politics, religion, and philosophy. He read books by famous African and international leaders and began to develop his own ideas about justice and equality. He was particularly influenced by the writings of African American leaders who had fought against discrimination in the United States. These writings showed him that black people around the world were struggling for the same basic rights and freedoms. During his time at Healdtown, Nelson also developed his skills as a public speaker. He participated in debates and gave speeches at school events. His teachers noticed his ability to persuade people with his words and his natural charisma. They encouraged him to continue developing these skills, which would prove to be so important in his future political career. After graduating from Healdtown in 1937, Nelson enrolled at the University of Fort Hare, the premier institution of higher learning for black South Africans. Fort Hare was often called the Oxford and Cambridge of Africa because of its academic reputation. Many future African leaders, including several who would become presidents of their countries, studied at Fort Hare during this period. At Fort Hare, Nelson studied English, anthropology, politics, and law. He was a serious student who worked hard and earned good grades. However, he was also becoming increasingly interested in student politics and social issues. He began to question why black students had so few rights and why they were not allowed to have a greater say in how the university was run. In his second year at Fort Hare, Nelson was elected to the Student Representative Council. However, he and other student leaders became frustrated with the university administration's refusal to improve the poor quality of food and to give students more say in university policies. When the administration ignored their demands, Nelson led a student boycott. He was subsequently suspended from the university and told he could only return if he agreed to serve on the Student Representative Council under the administration's terms. Nelson refused to compromise his principles. He left Fort Hare without completing his degree, a decision that disappointed Chief Jongintaba, who had hoped Nelson would become a counselor in the tribal government. However, this experience taught Nelson important lessons about standing up for what he believed in, even when there were personal costs involved. When Nelson returned to the Great Place, he discovered that Chief Jongintaba had arranged marriages for both him and Justice, the chief's son. The chief wanted Nelson to marry the daughter of a local priest, but Nelson had no interest in an arranged marriage. He wanted to choose his own path in life. This conflict led to a decision that would change the course of his life forever. In 1941, Nelson and Justice ran away to Johannesburg, the largest city in South Africa. They left behind the safety and security of rural life for the uncertainty and excitement of the big city. Johannesburg was the center of South Africa's gold mining industry and attracted people from all over the country looking for work and opportunity. For a young man from a small village, it was an overwhelming and intimidating place. In Johannesburg, Nelson experienced the harsh realities of apartheid for the first time. He saw how black people were forced to live in overcrowded townships, with poor sanitation and limited services. He witnessed the daily humiliations that black people faced under the system of racial segregation. He observed how white people controlled all the good jobs and lived in comfortable neighborhoods, while black people struggled to survive in poverty. Nelson found work as a security guard at a gold mine, but this job did not last long. When his employer discovered that he had run away from Chief Jongintaba, Nelson was fired. He then found work as an articled clerk at a law firm, which allowed him to continue his studies by correspondence. He was determined to complete his university degree and become a lawyer so that he could help his people fight against unjust laws. During this period, Nelson met Walter Sisulu, who became one of his closest friends and political mentors. Sisulu was already involved in political activities and introduced Nelson to other young African intellectuals who were thinking about how to challenge the apartheid system. Through these connections, Nelson began to learn about different political strategies and philosophies. The struggle against apartheid. In 1944, Nelson Mandela joined the African National Congress, a political organization that had been founded in 1912 to fight for the rights of black South Africans. At that time, the ANC was a relatively conservative organization that believed in polite petitions and peaceful protests. However, a younger generation of leaders, including Nelson, wanted the organization to take more direct action against the apartheid system. Together with Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, and other young activists, Nelson helped form the ANC Youth League in 1944. The Youth League believed that the older generation of ANC leaders was too patient and too willing to accept small improvements rather than demanding fundamental change. They wanted the ANC to adopt more militant strategies and to mobilize the masses of African people in the struggle for freedom. The Youth League developed a program of action that called for boycotts, strikes, and civil disobedience campaigns. They argued that black South Africans should not cooperate with laws that denied them basic human rights. This approach was influenced by the successful nonviolent resistance campaigns led by Mahatma Gandhi in India and by other freedom movements around the world. In 1948, the National Party came to power in South Africa and immediately began implementing a comprehensive system of racial segregation called apartheid. This system was more extreme and systematic than the racial discrimination that had existed before. Under apartheid, people were classified into different racial categories, and these classifications determined where they could live, work, go to school, and even whom they could marry. The apartheid laws created separate and unequal societies. White people, who made up less than 20% of the population, controlled the best land, the best jobs, and all political power. Black people, who made up the majority of the population, were forced to live in impoverished homelands and were denied basic rights such as the right to vote or to move freely around the country. Nelson and other ANC leaders realized that the apartheid system represented a major threat to the future of black South Africans. They began planning resistance campaigns to challenge these unjust laws. In 1952, the ANC launched the Defiance Campaign, which called on people to deliberately break apartheid laws and accept imprisonment as a form of protest. During the Defiance Campaign, Nelson emerged as one of the most prominent leaders of the resistance movement. He traveled around the country speaking at rallies and encouraging people to join the campaign. He was arrested several times for his political activities, but continued to speak out against apartheid. His courage and dedication inspired many others to join the struggle for freedom. The Defiance Campaign brought Nelson to national attention and established him as one of the rising stars of the liberation movement. However, it also brought him to the attention of the apartheid government, which began to monitor his activities closely. The government imposed banning orders on him, which restricted his movements and prevented him from attending political meetings or speaking in public. Despite these restrictions, Nelson continued his political work underground. He also pursued his legal career, and in 1952 opened the first black law firm in South Africa together with Oliver Tambo. Their firm, Mandela and Tambo, provided legal services to black people who could not afford other lawyers. They handled many cases involving apartheid laws and helped people who had been unfairly arrested or evicted from their homes. The law firm was located in Chancellor House in central Johannesburg, and it quickly became a meeting place for political activists and a symbol of black professional achievement. Nelson and Oliver worked long hours, helping their clients navigate the complex and discriminatory legal system. Through their legal work, they gained a deeper understanding of how apartheid laws affected ordinary people's daily lives. In 1955, the ANC and other anti-apartheid organizations organized the Congress of the People, a large gathering that brought together representatives from all racial groups to discuss the future of South Africa. This Congress adopted the Freedom Charter, a document that outlined the vision of a democratic, non-racial South Africa, where all people would have equal rights regardless of their skin color. The Freedom Charter declared that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, and that all national groups shall have equal rights. It called for democracy, human rights, and economic justice. This document became the guiding principles of the liberation movement and would later influence the Constitution of democratic South Africa. However, the apartheid government viewed the Freedom Charter as a treasonous document. In 1956, Nelson and 155 other leaders were arrested and charged with high treason. The government claimed that the Freedom Charter was a communist document that aimed to overthrow the state by violence. The treason trial would drag on for 4.5 years, during which the accused had to regularly appear in court while continuing their political activities. The turn to armed resistance. The Sharpeville Massacre on March 21, 1960, marked a turning point in the struggle against apartheid. On that day, police opened fire on a peaceful crowd of protesters who were demonstrating against the hated pass laws. 69 people were killed and 180 were wounded, many of them shot in the back as they tried to flee. The massacre shocked the world and demonstrated the apartheid government's willingness to use extreme violence against peaceful protesters. After Sharpeville, the government banned the ANC and other liberation organizations, forcing them to operate underground. The government also declared a state of emergency and arrested thousands of political activists. It became clear that peaceful protest alone would not bring about change in South Africa. The apartheid regime was prepared to use any amount of force to maintain white minority rule. Faced with this reality, Nelson and other ANC leaders made the difficult decision to abandon their commitment to nonviolent resistance. They concluded that they had no choice but to turn to armed struggle to defend themselves and to pressure the government to negotiate. This was not an easy decision, as many ANC leaders had deep moral objections to violence. In 1961, Nelson helped establish Umkhonto we Sizwe, which means Spear of the Nation in Zulu. This was the armed wing of the ANC, and Nelson became its first commander-in-chief. The organization planned to carry out acts of sabotage against government installations and economic targets while avoiding harm to civilians. The goal was to damage the apartheid system economically and to demonstrate that the liberation movement could strike back. Nelson traveled secretly to other African countries to receive military training and to seek support for the armed struggle. He learned about guerrilla warfare tactics and studied how other liberation movements had successfully fought against colonial powers. During this time, he was known by the code name the Black Pimpernel because of his ability to evade capture by the security police. However, Nelson's time as a fugitive came to an end on August 5, 1962, when he was arrested by police while traveling from Natal to Johannesburg. The arrest was the result of a tip-off, and Nelson was charged with incitement and leaving the country without a passport. He conducted his own defense at the trial and used the courtroom as a platform to explain the reasons for the ANC's turn to armed resistance. In his court statement, Nelson explained that the ANC had tried peaceful methods for 50 years, but had been met with increasing repression. He argued that the government's violence had left the liberation movement with no choice but to defend itself. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but this was only the beginning of his long imprisonment. While Nelson was serving his sentence on Robben Island, police raided the secret headquarters of Umkhonto we Sizwe at Lillisleaf Farm in Rivonia, a suburb of Johannesburg. They arrested several top leaders of the organization and seized documents that revealed the extent of the sabotage campaign. The evidence also implicated Nelson in the planning of the armed struggle. In 1964, Nelson and 7 other leaders were charged with sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government. This became known as the Rivonia trial, and it was one of the most important political trials in South African history. The defendants faced the death penalty if convicted, and the trial attracted international attention to the situation in South Africa. During the trial, Nelson gave one of the most famous speeches in the history of the struggle against apartheid. In his statement from the dock, he explained the reasons why the ANC had turned to armed resistance and outlined his vision for a democratic South Africa. He concluded his speech with these memorable words: "During my lifetime, I have dedicated myself to this struggle of the African people. I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." These words demonstrated Nelson's courage and his commitment to his principles, even in the face of possible execution. The speech was widely reported around the world and helped to establish Nelson as an international symbol of the struggle for freedom and justice. 27 years behind bars. On June 12, 1964, Nelson Mandela and 7 other defendants in the Rivonia trial were found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. They escaped the death penalty, possibly because of international pressure and the worldwide attention the trial had received. However, life imprisonment in apartheid South Africa was hardly a merciful sentence, especially for political prisoners. Nelson was sent to Robben Island, a small rocky island 7 kilometers off the coast of Cape Town. This island had a long history as a place of banishment and imprisonment. During the apartheid era, it became the maximum security prison, where the government sent its most dangerous political prisoners. The conditions on Robben Island were deliberately harsh, designed to break the spirit of the prisoners and to serve as a warning to others who might consider challenging the apartheid system. Life on Robben Island was extremely difficult. The prisoners were housed in small, damp cells, with only a thin mat on the floor for sleeping. They received inadequate food and clothing, and were forced to do hard labor in the limestone quarry under the blazing African sun. The work was backbreaking and dangerous, and many prisoners suffered permanent damage to their eyes and lungs from the lime dust. The prison authorities tried to humiliate and demoralize the political prisoners in every possible way. They were classified as the lowest category of prisoners, which meant they received fewer privileges than common criminals. They were not allowed to receive newspapers or to listen to radio broadcasts. Their letters were heavily censored, and they were permitted only one visit every 6 months from family members. Despite these harsh conditions, Nelson refused to let prison break his spirit. He maintained his dignity and continued to fight for better treatment for himself and his fellow prisoners. He studied the behavior of the prison warders and learned to speak Afrikaans, the language of many of the guards, so that he could communicate with them more effectively. Over time, he developed relationships with some of the warders and even gained their respect. Nelson understood that education was one of the few things that the prison authorities could not take away from the prisoners. He encouraged his fellow inmates to continue their studies and to share their knowledge with each other. Robben Island became known as the University because so many prisoners used their time in prison to complete their education. Nelson himself completed his law degree through correspondence courses while in prison. The political prisoners on Robben Island came from many different organizations and backgrounds, but they learned to work together and to support each other. They held regular discussions about political strategy and philosophy, and they maintained their commitment to the struggle for freedom. These discussions helped to keep their hopes alive and to prepare them for the day when they would be released. Nelson emerged as the natural leader of the political prisoners. He was respected by prisoners from all organizations, and even the prison authorities recognized his leadership qualities. He negotiated with the prison officials for better conditions and represented the prisoners' grievances. His calm, dignified manner and his willingness to find practical solutions to problems made him an effective advocate for his fellow prisoners. As the years passed, Nelson's reputation grew both inside and outside South Africa. International campaigns calling for his release gained momentum, and his name became known around the world. The slogan, "Free Nelson Mandela," appeared on banners and T-shirts in many countries. Musicians wrote songs about him, and governments imposed sanctions on South Africa to pressure the apartheid regime to release political prisoners. However, the apartheid government remained stubborn. They offered to release Nelson several times on condition that he renounce violence and go to live in one of the homelands. Each time, Nelson refused these conditional offers. He insisted that he would only accept unconditional release, and that he would not renounce the armed struggle while the apartheid system remained in place. In 1982, Nelson was transferred from Robben Island to Pollsmoor Prison in Cape Town. The conditions at Pollsmoor were somewhat better than on Robben Island, but Nelson was separated from many of his longtime comrades. The government hoped that isolating him from other political prisoners would weaken his influence, but this strategy did not work. Nelson continued to be regarded as the leader of the liberation movement, both by his supporters and by the international community. During his later years in prison, Nelson began to think more deeply about the future of South Africa. He realized that the liberation struggle would eventually succeed, but he was concerned about what would happen after apartheid ended. He worried that the transition to democracy could be accompanied by violence and revenge. He began to consider how the wounds of apartheid could be healed, and how black and white South Africans could learn to live together peacefully. These reflections led Nelson to begin thinking about the importance of reconciliation. He understood that South Africa's future depended on finding a way to build a united nation from the divided society that apartheid had created. This thinking would prove to be crucial when he was finally released from prison and became involved in negotiations for a democratic South Africa. Negotiations and the path to freedom. By the mid-1980s, South Africa was facing a severe crisis. The apartheid system was becoming increasingly unsustainable due to internal resistance, international sanctions, and changing global politics. The economy was struggling under the weight of sanctions and boycotts. Violence was escalating in the townships, and the government's attempts to reform apartheid without giving up white minority rule were failing. In 1985, President P.W. Botha offered to release Nelson Mandela on condition that he unconditionally reject violence as a political instrument. Nelson's response was read by his daughter Zinzi at a rally in Soweto. In it he stated, "I cannot and will not give any undertaking at a time when I and you, the people, are not free. Your freedom and mine cannot be separated." This response was met with thunderous applause and demonstrated that Nelson remained committed to the liberation struggle. Behind the scenes, however, some members of the apartheid government were beginning to realize that they needed to find a negotiated solution to the conflict. The alternative was likely to be a devastating civil war that would destroy the country. In 1989, F.W. de Klerk became president of South Africa and proved to be more willing than his predecessors to consider fundamental changes. In December 1989, Nelson had his first meeting with President de Klerk. This meeting marked the beginning of serious negotiations about the future of South Africa. Nelson impressed de Klerk with his intelligence, dignity, and reasonableness. Despite spending 27 years in prison, Nelson showed no bitterness or desire for revenge. Instead, he spoke about the need for reconciliation and his vision of a non-racial democracy. The negotiations were complex and difficult. There were many obstacles to overcome, including disagreements about the pace of change, the role of violence in the transition, and the protection of minority rights. Both sides had to make significant compromises and to convince their supporters to accept agreements that did not give them everything they wanted. On February 11, 1990, after 27 years in prison, Nelson Mandela walked free. His release was broadcast live on television around the world, and millions of people watched as he walked hand in hand with his wife Winnie through the gates of Victor Verster prison. He raised his fist in the ANC salute and smiled broadly as he greeted the crowd of supporters who had gathered to welcome him. Nelson's first speech as a free man was delivered from the balcony of Cape Town City Hall to a crowd of over 50,000 people. In this speech, he called for continued struggle until all South Africans enjoyed equal rights. He also emphasized his commitment to peace and reconciliation, saying that the time for the healing of the wounds has come. This message of reconciliation would become a central theme of his leadership during the transition to democracy. The period between Nelson's release and the first democratic elections in 1994 was marked by both progress and setbacks. Negotiations between the ANC and the government made steady progress, but violence continued in many parts of the country. There were conflicts between different political parties, and some extremist groups on both sides tried to derail the peace process. Nelson played a crucial role in keeping the negotiations on track. He worked tirelessly to build trust between former enemies and to convince all parties that a negotiated settlement was better than continued conflict. His moral authority and his commitment to reconciliation helped to persuade skeptics on both sides that the peace process could succeed. In 1993, Nelson and F.W. de Klerk were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts to bring about a peaceful end to apartheid. This recognition by the international community helped to legitimize the negotiation process and to encourage all parties to continue working toward a democratic settlement. The negotiations culminated in the adoption of an interim constitution that established a democratic system based on one person, one vote. Elections were scheduled for April 27, 1994, and all adult South Africans, regardless of race, would be allowed to vote for the first time in the country's history. President of the new South Africa. The 1994 election was a historic moment for South Africa. For the first time in the country's history, people of all races stood in long lines together to cast their votes. The atmosphere was peaceful and celebratory, despite fears that violence might disrupt the process. Many elderly Black South Africans wept as they voted for the first time in their lives. The African National Congress won a decisive victory, receiving 62% of the vote. This gave the ANC enough seats to form a government, but not enough to change the constitution unilaterally, which helped to reassure minority groups about their future in the new South Africa. Nelson Mandela, now 75 years old, was elected as the country's first Black president. On May 10, 1994, Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as President of South Africa in a ceremony attended by world leaders from around the globe. The event was broadcast live to a worldwide audience of over 1 billion people. In his inaugural address, Nelson spoke about the need to build a society where all people could enjoy freedom, prosperity, and dignity. He declared that never, never and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another. One of the most powerful moments of the inauguration ceremony came when South African military jets flew overhead in salute to the new president. These were the same jets that had once been used to defend the apartheid system. But now they were honoring the man who had spent 27 years in prison for opposing that system. It was a powerful symbol of how completely South Africa had been transformed. As president, Nelson faced enormous challenges. The apartheid system had left the country deeply divided and unequal. Millions of black South Africans lived in poverty, without access to adequate housing, education, or health care. The economy needed to be restructured to provide opportunities for all citizens. Most importantly, the wounds of apartheid needed to be healed so that the different racial groups could learn to live together as one nation. Nelson's approach to these challenges was guided by his philosophy of reconciliation. Rather than seeking revenge against those who had oppressed his people, he encouraged forgiveness and unity. He understood that South Africa needed the skills and resources of all its citizens, regardless of their race, to build a successful democracy. One of Nelson's most important decisions as president was to establish the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. This commission was tasked with investigating human rights violations during the apartheid era and with promoting reconciliation between former enemies. The commission offered amnesty to those who confessed to political crimes and gave victims the opportunity to tell their stories. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was controversial, as some people felt that those who had committed crimes should be punished rather than forgiven. However, Nelson believed that the commission was necessary to help South Africa move forward without being trapped by the bitterness of the past. He argued that the choice was between justice and peace, and that South Africa needed peace more than it needed revenge. Nelson also worked hard to reassure white South Africans that they had a place in the new democracy. He retained many white civil servants and military officers in their positions, arguing that the country needed their experience and expertise. He learned Afrikaans, the language of many white South Africans, and made efforts to understand their culture and concerns. One of the most symbolic moments of Nelson's presidency came during the 1995 Rugby World Cup, which was held in South Africa. Rugby was traditionally a sport played and followed mainly by white South Africans, and many black South Africans saw it as a symbol of apartheid oppression. However, when South Africa reached the final, Nelson decided to attend the match wearing the green and gold jersey of the South African team. When South Africa won the World Cup, Nelson presented the trophy to the team captain, Francois Pienaar, in front of a stadium filled mainly with white supporters. The crowd, which might have been expected to boo the former prisoner, instead cheered enthusiastically for their president. This moment demonstrated how Nelson's leadership was helping to unite the country across racial lines. During his presidency, Nelson also focused on improving the lives of ordinary South Africans. His government built millions of new homes, connected townships to electricity and water supplies, and established free health care for pregnant women and young children. Progress was slower than many people hoped, but significant improvements were made in the quality of life for millions of South Africans. Nelson served only one term as president, stepping down in 1999 at the age of 81. This decision demonstrated his commitment to democratic principles and helped to establish a precedent for peaceful transitions of power in South Africa. Many leaders in Africa and elsewhere have clung to power for decades, but Nelson showed that true leadership sometimes means knowing when to step aside. Legacy of the Great Reconciler. After leaving the presidency, Nelson Mandela remained active in public life for several more years. He established the Nelson Mandela Foundation to continue his work promoting human rights, democracy, and reconciliation. He also became involved in international efforts to resolve conflicts and to fight against poverty and disease, particularly HIV/AIDS, which had become a major crisis in South Africa. Nelson used his international stature to draw attention to global problems and to encourage world leaders to take action. He spoke out about the need for wealthy countries to help developing nations, and he criticized powerful nations when he believed they were acting unjustly. Despite his advanced age, he continued to travel around the world, meeting with leaders and speaking at important events. One of Nelson's most important contributions during his post-presidential years was his work to combat the stigma associated with HIV/AIDS. South Africa had one of the highest infection rates in the world, but many people were reluctant to discuss the disease openly. Nelson broke this silence by speaking candidly about AIDS and encouraging people to get tested and treated. In 2005, Nelson made the difficult decision to publicly announce that his son, Magatho, had died of AIDS. This announcement was particularly significant because it came from someone of Nelson's stature and helped to reduce the shame and secrecy that surrounded the disease. His openness encouraged many other families to speak about their experiences with AIDS and to seek help. As Nelson grew older, he gradually withdrew from public life. He made his last major public appearance at the closing ceremony of the 2010 FIFA World Cup, which was held in South Africa. Seeing the frail but dignified figure of the 91-year-old former president brought tears to the eyes of many spectators and reminded the world of his extraordinary contribution to his country and to humanity. Nelson Mandela died peacefully at his home in Johannesburg on December 5, 2013, at the age of 95. His death was mourned around the world, with tributes pouring in from world leaders, celebrities, and ordinary people whose lives had been touched by his example. His state funeral was attended by more than 90 heads of state and government, making it one of the largest gatherings of world leaders in history. The legacy that Nelson Mandela left behind extends far beyond South Africa. His life demonstrated that it is possible to overcome even the most entrenched systems of oppression through patience, courage, and moral leadership. He showed that former enemies can become friends, and that societies can heal from the wounds of the past. Nelson's commitment to reconciliation, rather than revenge, provided a model for other countries dealing with the aftermath of conflict and oppression. His example has inspired peace processes in many parts of the world, and his philosophy of Ubuntu, the African concept that we are all interconnected, and that our humanity is bound up with the humanity of others, has influenced thinking about human rights and social justice globally. Perhaps most importantly, Nelson Mandela proved that one person can make a difference in the world. His journey from a rural village boy to a global icon of peace and justice shows that with determination, courage, and moral clarity, individuals can change the course of history. His life reminds us that we all have the power to stand up against injustice and to work for a better world. Today, Nelson Mandela's name is synonymous with courage, forgiveness, and moral leadership. Schools, streets, and institutions around the world bear his name. July 18, his birthday, has been declared Nelson Mandela International Day by the United Nations, encouraging people everywhere to spend 67 minutes, 1 minute for each year. He spent fighting for justice, helping others, and making their communities better. The story of Nelson Mandela teaches us that no matter how dark the present may seem, there is always hope for a better future. His life shows us that with patience, perseverance, and unwavering commitment to our principles, we can overcome any obstacle. Most importantly, his example reminds us that true greatness lies not in seeking revenge against those who have wronged us, but in finding the strength to forgive and to work together to build a better world for all.